Driving for Uber had become a routine for me. It was a way to make some extra cash during the late-night hours, ferrying passengers to their destinations in the sprawling city. But one night, I picked up a fare that would forever change the way I looked at the world. It was around midnight when the request came in. The pin on the map led me to a dimly lit street in an unfamiliar part of town. I pulled up to the curb, and a figure emerged from the shadows. The passenger was a woman, her face hidden beneath a hooded sweatshirt and her posture slouched as if she were carrying the weight of the world on her shoulders. She entered the car without a word, her eyes cast downward. "Where to?" I asked, trying to break the ice. She hesitated for a moment before finally giving me an address in a quiet, suburban neighborhood. It was a long drive from our current location, but I didn't mind. I started the trip and merged onto the highway. The woman remained silent throughout the journey, her gaze fixed on something unseen beyond the window. I couldn't help but feel a sense of unease, but I chalked it up to the late hour and the fact that she might have had a rough day. As we approached the suburban neighborhood, the streets grew narrower and darker. The houses were set far apart, and the only illumination came from the occasional street lamp. I pulled up to the address she had given me, a quaint two-story house that seemed like something out of a storybook. The woman hesitated before paying the fare and getting out of the car. She turned to face me, her eyes finally meeting mine. "Thank you," she said, her voice trembling. "But there's something you should know." I leaned in, curious about what she had to say. She took a deep breath and began to recount a chilling tale of how she had been plagued by a malevolent entity for years. She spoke of shadows that moved on their own, whispers in the dead of night, and the feeling of being watched. The more she talked, the more my unease grew. I had heard my fair share of strange stories from passengers, but there was something about her demeanor that made this tale feel all too real. She explained that she had been trying to escape the entity, to seek refuge with a friend who lived in this quiet neighborhood, but she had no idea if the entity would follow her or what it wanted. I didn't know what to say, but I offered her some comforting words and wished her well. As she walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just become entangled in something far beyond my understanding. I continued to drive for Uber, but the encounter weighed heavily on my mind. I couldn't stop thinking about the woman and the eerie story she had shared. It was as if a dark cloud had settled over me, casting a shadow on my once normal life. Days went by, and I couldn't escape the feeling that I was being watched. Shadows seemed to move on their own, and strange whispers echoed through my apartment at night. I couldn't sleep, and my once peaceful life had become a living nightmare. Desperate for answers, I began to research the history of the neighborhood where I had dropped off the woman. What I discovered sent chills down my spine. The quiet suburban neighborhood had a dark past, a history of unexplained disappearances and eerie occurrences dating back decades. Local legends spoke of a malevolent entity that had haunted the area for generations, preying on those who dared to cross its path. I couldn't deny the chilling connection between the woman's story and the history of the neighborhood. It was as if she had brought the entity with her, and now it had latched onto me. I reached out to the woman, hoping that she could shed some light on the situation. But my messages went unanswered, and her profile on the Uber app had disappeared, as if she had never existed. As the days turned into weeks, the entity's presence in my life grew more malevolent. I could feel it closing in, its whispers growing louder and more menacing. It was as if it wanted something from me, something I couldn't comprehend. I became a recluse, barricading myself in my apartment, hoping that the entity would lose interest and move on. But it was relentless, tormenting me day and night. I sought help from paranormal experts and psychics, but none could offer a solution. It seemed that I was trapped in a nightmare with no way out. One fateful night, as I lay in bed, paralyzed by fear, the entity finally revealed its true nature. It materialized before me, a shadowy figure with hollow, soulless eyes. It whispered my name, a cold, chilling sound that sent a shockwave of terror through my body. And then it spoke, its voice a haunting, otherworldly sound that echoed in my mind. "You were the one I wanted all along." With those words, the entity engulfed me in darkness, and I knew that I had become forever entangled in its malevolent grasp. My life had become a never-ending nightmare, a journey into the unknown from which there was no escape. As I write this, I can feel the entity's presence closing in once again. I don't know what it wants from me or how to break free from its grip. All I know is that the encounter on that fateful night drive for Uber has changed my life in ways I could never have imagined, and the terror it has brought into my life is something I will carry with me until the end of my days.
The night was cold and misty, with a haunting chill that crept into my bones as I drove along the desolate highway. I had always enjoyed the solitude of late-night drives, but this particular journey would leave me with a horror that still sends shivers down my spine. I had just left a friend's house, having spent the evening reminiscing over old times and enjoying a few drinks. The road ahead stretched into a dark abyss, illuminated only by the soft glow of my headlights. I relished the quiet, the rhythmic hum of the engine, and the rhythmic beat of the rain against the windshield. As I navigated the winding road, a flicker of movement caught my eye. Up ahead, standing at the side of the road in the pouring rain, was a woman. She was drenched, her clothes clinging to her body, and her long, wet hair framed a face that was etched with sadness. Instinctively, I pulled over and rolled down my window. The rain pelted the interior of the car as I called out to her. "Hey, do you need a ride?" She nodded silently and climbed into the passenger seat, her soaked clothes leaving a trail of moisture behind her. Her face remained hidden beneath the curtain of wet hair, and her presence sent a shiver down my spine. "Thank you," she finally said, her voice quivering. "I've been walking for miles." I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. Something about her seemed off, but I couldn't quite put my finger on it. Perhaps it was the eerie stillness that seemed to surround her. As I continued down the road, I tried to engage her in conversation, asking where she was headed and why she had been walking alone in the rain. She responded in short, cryptic sentences, never once looking at me. The miles passed in silence, the only sound the patter of rain against the roof of the car. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that this encounter was far from ordinary. We approached a desolate stretch of road, the trees on either side closing in, their branches creating a dark, tunnel-like canopy overhead. I could feel the tension in the air, a palpable unease that hung between us. Suddenly the woman spoke, her voice low and haunting. "This is where it happened." I glanced at her, puzzled by her words. "What happened?" She turned to me, her eyes filled with a sorrow that seemed to stretch beyond the limits of time. "My accident. This is where I died." My heart froze in my chest as I realized the implications of her words. I tried to maintain control, to convince myself that she was just spinning a ghost story, but something about her seemed all too real. The rain beat down on the car, drowning out my racing thoughts. I couldn't tear my eyes away from her, my fear and curiosity locking me in place. She continued her tale, recounting a horrifying car accident that had occurred on this very stretch of road. She claimed to have been the victim, her life tragically cut short in a twisted, nightmarish collision. As she spoke, I could feel the car growing colder, the air thickening with an oppressive presence. It was as though the very atmosphere had been tainted by her words. "We were coming back from a party," she said, her voice barely more than a whisper. "I was in the back seat and we crashed into a tree. I never made it out alive." I tried to speak, to offer some words of comfort, but my voice caught in my throat. The gravity of the situation weighed on me like a leaden shroud. The car's headlights pierced the darkness, revealing a gnarled, ancient tree up ahead. It stood as a grim sentinel, its branches stretching out like skeletal fingers. The woman's gaze remained fixed on it, her eyes filled with a mournful longing. "Stop the car," she said suddenly, her voice urgent. I complied, pulling over to the side of the road. She climbed out of the car, her silhouette framed by the headlights. She walked toward the tree, her movements slow and deliberate. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched her, a sense of dread creeping over me. I knew that something unnatural was unfolding before my eyes, something beyond my comprehension. She reached the tree and turned to face me, her eyes locked on mine. "Thank you for the ride," she said, her voice echoing in the stillness of the night. And then, with a sudden, ghostly smile, she stepped into the tree. Her body seemed to dissolve into the ancient wood, her form merging with the bark and branches, until she disappeared entirely. I sat in stunned silence, unable to process what I had just witnessed. The rain continued to fall, but the world had become a surreal and haunting place. I eventually gathered my wits and drove away from that eerie stretch of road, my mind spinning with questions and fear. What had I encountered that night? Was she a ghost, a spirit trapped in a never-ending loop of tragedy? To this day, I can't explain what happened that night, and I've never been able to shake the feeling that I crossed paths with something otherworldly and malevolent. The encounter haunts my dreams, a reminder that the line between the living and the dead is thinner than we can ever truly know, and that some encounters are best left unexplored.
Late one foggy night, I found myself driving on a seemingly endless highway. The dense mist obscuring my vision, and the monotonous hum of the engine lulling me into a drowsy state. My eyelids were heavy, and I desperately needed a break from the long drive. But little did I know that taking a wrong exit would lead me to a disturbing encounter that would forever haunt my nightmares. I had been on the road for hours, trying to reach my destination before dawn. The GPS had been my constant companion, guiding me through the winding maze of interstates and unfamiliar roads. However, as I approached a fork in the highway, I made a hasty decision and took the wrong exit. The mist grew denser, and the visibility dropped to a few feet ahead. Panic gnawed at me as I realized I was on an unfamiliar road with no signs of civilization in sight. I fumbled with my phone to check the GPS, but there was no signal. I had no choice but to continue driving, hoping to find a way back to the highway. The road grew narrower, flanked by dense woods that seemed to close in on me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was in a place I shouldn't be. Just when despair began to set in, I saw a faint glimmer of light up ahead. It was a dilapidated roadside diner, its neon sign flickering weakly through the mist. I pulled into the gravel lot and parked my car, relieved to have found some semblance of civilization. The diner's exterior was weathered and worn, a relic of a bygone era. I hesitated for a moment, debating whether to go inside, but the allure of warm food and a chance to get my bearings won me over. As I entered, a bell above the door chimed softly, announcing my presence. The interior was dimly lit, and the atmosphere was heavy with the smell of grease and coffee. A few patrons sat at the counter, their heads bowed over their plates as they ate in silence. I took a seat at the counter and ordered a cup of coffee, hoping it would help shake off the fatigue that had settled over me. The waitress, an elderly woman with tired eyes, poured the coffee without a word and left me to my thoughts. I sipped the bitter brew, glancing around the diner. The patrons seemed lost in their own worlds, their faces shrouded in shadow. There was something eerie about the place, a sense of isolation that sent a shiver down my spine. As I sat there, I noticed a man at the end of the counter. He was hunched over a plate of food, his face obscured by a tattered hat and a long, unkempt beard. He seemed out of place, like a traveler who had wandered too far from the beaten path. I tried to shake off my unease and struck up a conversation with the man. He spoke in hushed tones, his words cryptic and disjointed. He claimed to have been on the road for years, searching for something he couldn't quite put into words. I listened with a growing sense of dread as he spoke of the mist that surrounded the diner, a mist that never seemed to lift. He claimed that the diner was a place where time stood still, a liminal space between the living and the dead. I laughed nervously, dismissing his words as the ramblings of a madman. But as I glanced out the window, I saw that the mist had grown thicker, shrouding the parking lot in an impenetrable fog. Panic surged through me, and I jumped up from my seat, ready to leave the diner behind. But as I reached for the door, the bell above it chimed softly, and the room fell silent. The patrons, the waitress, and the mysterious man all turned to stare at me with vacant, lifeless eyes. I stumbled backward, my heart pounding in my chest. The atmosphere in the diner had shifted, and I was overwhelmed by a suffocating sense of dread. It was as if I had stepped into another realm, a place where the boundaries between the living and the dead had blurred. Desperation fueled my actions as I pushed through the door and into the fog-shrouded night. I couldn't see more than a few feet ahead, and the air was thick with an unnatural stillness. It was as if the world had frozen in time. I stumbled through the mist, my heart racing as I searched for my car. But no matter how far I walked, I couldn't find it. It was as if the road had disappeared and I was trapped in a nightmarish void. The fog seemed to close in around me, and I heard voices in the distance, whispers that echoed through the mist. They spoke of lost souls and eternal torment, of a place where time had no meaning. Fear gripped me, and I ran blindly through the fog, desperate to escape the voices and the suffocating stillness. But no matter how fast I ran, I couldn't escape the sense that I was trapped in a never-ending nightmare. As the hours passed, I grew weary, my strength waning. The fog seemed to seep into my very soul, and I felt myself slipping away, becoming one with the mist. And then, just as I was about to succumb to the darkness, I saw a glimmer of light in the distance. It was the diner, its neon sign flickering weakly through the fog. With renewed hope, I stumbled toward the diner, the voices and the mist growing fainter with each step. As I reached the gravel lot, I saw my car, parked in the same spot where I had left it. I climbed into the car, my heart still pounding, and sped away from the diner, the mist fading behind me. I drove for hours, not stopping until I reached the safety of the highway. To this day, I can't explain what happened that night or how I managed to escape the fog-shrouded nightmare. But one thing is certain. I will never forget the chilling encounter that occurred on a wrong exit, an encounter that still haunts my nightmares and leaves me questioning the boundaries between the living and the dead.